Clean up for the rest of your life, parasite. Seated in his wheelchair, Michael spat out these words. It was probably his way of venting the stress built up from the painful physical therapy he kept repeating. He had lashed out at me like this several times before. But this time, I couldn't bear it. It felt like something snapped deep inside my head. A sound that signified I had reached my breaking point. Sure. I responded with a smile on the surface, but inside, I thought. Michael, even though I'm your stepmother, I've lived as your mother. But that's going to end today. I'll show you what happens when you underestimate an adult. My name is Julie. I'm turning 29 this year. I debuted as a light novel writer in my late teens. I still get enough writing requests and fan mail to maintain my status as a successful author. Especially in the past 2 or 3 years, I've been taking on more romance novels targeted at adults rather than young people. I met Chris through an arrangement. Given my profession as a writer, there were hardly any romantic encounters. Worried, my parents introduced him to me. That's where I met Chris. Chris was divorced and came into the marriage with an 11-year-old son, Michael, which made me feel uneasy. Chris and I have a 7-year age difference. We bought a used home right after getting married and lived there together. Chris was popular among the neighbors. An older husband is so reliable, isn't it? Yeah. I forced a smile during interactions with the neighbors. In truth, I had never found Chris to be reliable. Because Chris. Hey Julie, come here for a sec. All right. I cut short the chit-chat and hurried over to Chris. I was relieved on the inside. Small talk isn't really my thing. What were you guys talking about? Nothing important. What's up? I asked, and Chris's eyes lit up. I've written a new piece. Introduce me to the publisher, will you? Sure. Here we go again. I could feel my expression darken. Chris aspired to be a writer. Like me, he had been aiming for newcomer awards since his teens. But he hadn't managed to debut yet. And it's unlikely he will in the future. It's a piece I'm really confident about. Can I read it? Of course. Chris smiled proudly. But that smile would soon twist into anger. I went back to the study and looked over the manuscript Chris had given me. It was no good, as usual. I felt bad for Chris, who was nervously sitting in the chair, but I had my reputation to consider. Especially because we're family, I can't play favorites. I can't introduce this to the publisher. Why not? As expected, Chris exploded in anger. I sighed. Chris's writing was immature. He hadn't even followed the basic rules of manuscript formatting. There were so many typos and errors that I was holding my head in my hands while reading. I've told you there are rules to writing. I don't care about that. Even when cautioned, Chris simply wouldn't listen. You should study more about writing expressions. Read books. I'm a working adult. I don't have time to read books. His words spiked with resentment. I grimaced involuntarily. I was reading books even when I was busy studying for exams. During commutes, whenever I had a moment. Enough already. That's how he always ends our conversations unilaterally. Reliable because he's older? That's ridiculous. Chris is childish. He can't accept his own shortcomings and explodes when they're pointed out, just like a spoiled child. You're just jealous of my talent. It's not like that. In truth, I've never seen any literary talent in Chris's work. Because it would be too harsh to tell him that directly, I've been troubled by it. Yet, Chris starts making claims that are convenient for him again. This time, I'm gonna have your editor look at the manuscript directly. Stop it! I don't want to trouble the editor as well, not just me. Just as I thought this, I heard footsteps in the hallway. Dad. Hey, Michael. Welcome back. Chris quickly cheered up in an instant. I'm always surprised by how quickly he can change his mood. I got an essay assignment at school. Write it for me, Dad. Write it yourself and don't cheat. I immediately said. Michael is Chris's son. Perhaps because of his difficult age, being 11 years old, Michael's attitude towards me, his stepmother, is very harsh. Even now, he snaps back with harsh words, I didn't ask for your opinion. Old lady, just go and play with your computer in your study. Old lady! That struck me subtly. But this is not the time to be upset. Chris, who is soft on his son, might end up writing the essay for him. Despite that it would hinder Michael's growth. I'm not playing on the computer. Writing novels is my job and getting paid to write essays, what a sweet life you have. Michael wouldn't take anything I said seriously. I like Dad's writing better. Oh. That's my boy. Can't let down a fan. Guess I have to chip in. Yay! Once again, Chris was swayed by Michael's obvious flattery and took on the task of ghostwriting. Father and son. It's fine that blood-related father and son get along well. But I am also a part of this family now. It's frustrating. While putting on my apron, I rushed into the kitchen. Wait, I'm making it now. Not impressed that you slack on housework just because you're a writer. Chris threw in a snide remark at the perfect moment. I was making fried eggs in the frying pan. In the midst of it, I said, it's been tough with the deadline coming up. Deadline? So you've submitted the manuscript? That question felt odd. Chris usually shows no interest in my writing. Why today? No, I plan to check it once more this evening before submitting it. Huh. While I answered somewhat skeptically, Chris gave a distracted response. Even though he was the one who asked. So, this evening, huh? Chris? No, it's nothing. Where did his earlier irritation go? Suddenly, Chris showed a smile. Weird. Thinking this, I glanced at the clock again and screamed. Wow, it's so late. Chris, can you wake up Michael? Got it. Chris nodded easily and stood up from his chair. This was also strange. Usually, he would be too lazy to help. But today, something was off. Maybe I'm overthinking it. I convinced myself as I finished preparing the meal. By the time breakfast was laid out on the table, Michael was also seated. He seemed still sleepy, rubbing his eyes frequently. Yet, he didn't forget to throw a dig at me. It's all just lazy food. I cooked the eggs and soup, you know? No response came. Ignoring me, Michael started eating, and I sighed. That was the moment. Ugh. Chris? What's wrong? Suddenly, Chris started clutching his head in pain. Startled, I stood up from my chair. Are you feeling sick? Yeah, I've got a headache. If it's bad, maybe you should go to the hospital. I'm fine. Even so, it was rare for Chris to complain about feeling unwell. Visibly flustered, Chris then said, I'm gonna take the day off work today. I nodded in agreement. That sounds good. Rest up in your room. Dad, are you okay? Thanks, both of you. Chris seemed more compliant today, perhaps weakened by his illness. It was a bit anticlimactic, but at the same time, I found it somewhat endearing. Perhaps his earlier odd behavior was because he was hiding how bad he felt. After breakfast, I let Chris rest in bed. Make sure you look after Dad, okay? I know. Michael said firmly as he left for school. I might make some porridge for lunch. As I went about my morning chores, that thought crossed my mind. After finishing up the household tasks, I was walking down the hallway. I saw Chris heading towards the living room. Chris? I called out, but he didn't seem to notice me. Then, for some reason, he went into my study. What? Confusion welled up inside me. What would he need in my study? Especially since he's supposed to be sick in bed. However, the way Chris walked seemed steady. A bad feeling crept over me. Chris! I followed him into the study. Chris turned around with a surprised look. Julie, what's up? What are you doing in my study? Chris didn't answer. I'm hungry. With that, he left the study. I was more confused than ever. I too left the study, still puzzled. The truth became clear later that evening.
What is this manuscript?
What? The email from my editor was filled with confusion. As I read on, my face turned pale.
You've got to be kidding.
According to my editor, a manuscript full of nonsense had been sent under my name. The content of the manuscript was exactly like the novel Chris had shown me the day before. Which means,
Chris was in the study to send his manuscript to the publisher.
And he did it under the guise of being my manuscript. Naturally, this caused significant damage to the publisher. And it was a situation that could cost me my reputation.
This piece cannot be published as a new work. Don't publish it. That's not my manuscript.
I hurriedly typed my response.
It seems someone I know impersonated me and sent the manuscript.
I couldn't bring myself to say it was my husband's doing. I resent my own manuscript again and sighed.
Chris, what were you thinking?
I felt like holding my head in my hands. It seems Chris used a fake illness to create an opportunity to send his manuscript. And he took advantage of me being busy with housework to send it to the publisher.
I said I'd submit the manuscript this evening.
Thinking this far, it felt like a poorly written novel. I wished it were a lie. I wanted to believe that all my suspicions were too much, and Chris was genuinely ill. But there was Chris, chatting and laughing with Michael as they returned home.
That woman totally fell for it. That's my dad. I bet the publisher's folks are freaking out right now.
Yeah. I felt dizzy after overhearing their conversation. Yes. They were indeed shocked. At a terrible quality. I nearly lost the trust of my editor because of what Chris did.
Now I'm a debut writer too. You'll surpass that old lady soon.
The two laughed loudly. I crouched in the shadows, tears of frustration streaming down my face. No matter what I say, it won't get through to those two. And, as expected, Chris started frequently sending his own manuscripts from my computer to publishers without my approval. Of course, none of them got the green light. I was the one who ended up having to apologize.
I'm sorry.
I typed out an apology and wondered why I was still with such a person. Michael was still discontented that his father hadn't made a professional debut. He took out his frustration on me, an active writer.
I can't believe your work won an award. Did you use a bribe or something?
He would say such things openly even when I was around.
Michael, I don't approve of you speaking so ill of Julie so loudly.
Chris would ostensibly defend me, but I had no illusions about his true feelings. He was with me because I was a writer. And he was using that to try to become one himself. That much was clear from the recent manuscript incident. That's why Chris had no intention of divorcing me. He would reprimand Michael when I was around. But when I wasn't, they'd both talk down to me.
Why did I even end up with such a person?
Lately, while doing housework, that's all I could think about. I could no longer trust Chris. And Michael had no endearing qualities. He never warmed up to me. That was to be expected. To Michael, I was just a stepmother. But having my work insulted was more than I could bear. My work is like my child. I couldn't stand to have it spoken ill of.
Maybe I should just leave?
Eventually, I even started muttering such things to myself. But if I chose divorce now, what would my parents think? That was the only thing holding me back. Then, suddenly, the call came.
Hello? What? Michael's been in an accident.
It was during Michael's time to head home from school. The teacher, sounding panicked, explained that Michael had tried to cross the street against the signal and been hit by a car. Honestly, jaywalking was partly to blame for his own misfortune. But any such sarcastic thoughts vanished the moment I saw him at the hospital.
Michael! Don't look at me.
He was trying to be tough, but he was still just a kid. Michael lay in the hospital bed, heavily bandaged. His arms and legs were securely fixed with bandages. Probably, only his neck could move freely. It was a terrible sight.
He's been conscious since he was brought in. But because the injuries were severe, emergency surgery was necessary.
He had just woken up from the anesthesia. The attending doctor continued.
He will need to stay in the hospital and undergo physical therapy to walk again. How much will that cost?
I asked hesitantly. Hearing the word surgery had drained the color from my face. Plus, with the impending hospital stay, I wondered how much it would all cost. I hoped it would be an amount manageable with our combined incomes.
It's not about you, but about money, huh? If we don't have the money, you can't get physical therapy,
I retorted, and Michael fell silent. In the meantime, I contacted Chris. He was supposed to still be at work. After the call went through, I heard Chris's voice.
Julie? What's going on at this hour?
Actually. After I explained the situation, Chris was lost for words for a moment. His own son had been in a traffic accident. His agitation was surely greater than mine. Eventually, Chris said in a trembling voice.
Is Michael okay?
Yes, he's fully conscious now. Want to talk to him?
Sure.
I brought the phone to Michael's ear.
Dad.
Michael cried out for his father, then started sobbing. Chris seemed at a loss for how to react. I continued to receive explanations from the doctor. About the cost of the surgery, the procedures for hospitalization, and the details of the physical therapy. I had to understand all this and respond while nearly panicking. So, first about the cost of the surgery. It seemed that Michael, still crying, wasn't hearing any of this. I decided to first figure out how to cover the quoted costs. Of course, paying the full amount at once would be difficult. I chose to arrange a payment plan with the hospital. Exhausted after completing the arrangements, Chris arrived. How's Michael?
He seems to have fallen asleep.
I see. At least he was alive, Chris muttered, tears glistening in his eyes.
About the costs of the surgery, they're going to be drawn from my account for now. What's with that reaction?
I had a bad feeling. As I involuntarily frowned, Chris predictably began to say something. I've got a car loan, you know.
So, Julie, could you pay for Michael's surgery expenses?
What? I was bewildered, having thought that we would manage together with our combined incomes. However, even half a month later, there was no sign of Chris paying any hospital-related expenses.
Well, it's nice having a wife who's a successful author, financially reliable and all,
he said with a smile. I was dumbfounded. At the same time, I found myself contemplating the divorce papers I had hidden in a drawer. If I divorce Chris now, what will happen to Michael? Though he is my stepson, I have treated him as my own. Leaving him and walking out would seem heartless. But
clean up for the rest of your life, parasite.
That's what Michael said to me when I visited him. Physical therapy had already started by then. Because he was forcing his impaired body to move, the pain seemed to be considerable. With that context, Michael had been in a bad mood ever since starting physical therapy. I thought it must be hard on him. So, I had overlooked a lot of things. But even I have my limits. And today, I had reached them. All right. My voice was surprisingly cheerful. I had been agonizing over whether to divorce Chris for Michael's sake. What a foolish waste of time.
I won't be visiting you anymore, so rest easy. Yeah, and don't ever show your face here again, old lady.
Unaware of everything, Michael said this triumphantly. I no longer hesitated.
I won't be paying for the surgery anymore. Please send future bills to Chris.
I had already informed the hospital. The process was still troublesome, but a stronger emotion was driving me. Anger. Both the irresponsible and childish Chris and Michael, who defiantly opposed me without reason, could do as they pleased. After returning home, I continued with my actions.
Hello? I'd like to sell my house. Could you please tell me the procedure?
As I sought professional advice, I moved forward with the preparations. I had paid the down payment when we bought this house. At that point, who really is the parasite?
Michael doesn't know anything, does he?
I mused, almost singing. In Michael's mind, the income from my writing must seem insignificant. He must think I'm living a barely manageable life supported by Chris. But the reality is the opposite. Without the royalties from my books, our household couldn't function. Chris spends most of his income on his luxury car hobby. He completely relies on my income as an author for living expenses. And yet, he has often sabotaged my career by sending his manuscripts to publishers, hoping to become an author himself.
Chris really needs to face reality.
That day, I completed the procedures to sell the house. I also arranged for a company to pick up the furniture. The offered sale price was much lower than expected, but it couldn't be helped.
Please, take everything at that price.
Sure. As the movers started their work, I thought about my future.
Maybe I should move downtown. Then I could meet directly with my editor.
As I considered this, I found myself smiling. When was the last time I felt this joyful? Probably an emotion I had forgotten since getting married.
Goodbye, Chris.
I left the divorce papers on the table and walked out of the house. Because I'm not a parasite. Rather, they had been parasitic on my life. Let them face reality. And let them be at a loss. Just as I arrived at my parents' home, a call from Chris came in.
What's wrong? What do you mean, what's wrong? Do you even realize what you've done?
Yes. I acted with full awareness. And so, I remained calm, no matter what was said.
That house is practically mine to dispose of as I see fit. You're thinking of abandoning your family?
Chris's voice trembled as he asked. That's understandable. Chris still has his car loan to pay off. Paying that off will be hard enough without being abandoned by me.
That's good, isn't it? Now you don't have to take out a house loan either. Let's forget about each other and live our lives separately. You think you can just do whatever you want? Whatever I want, huh?
I couldn't help but scoff. Of all people, Chris was using that phrase. After all the whims he's indulged at my expense.
I'm planning to get a medical report from a good doctor a friend of my father knows.
You're healthy, he retorted immediately. He really doesn't understand. Chris, that is.
Physically, I'm fine. But living with you both has done quite a number on me mentally.
Since we got married, I began keeping a secret diary. It started with feelings of happiness. I wanted to document my life with my new family, a happy diary. But reality is ironically cruel. The mistreatments I've endured since marrying you are all handwritten in this diary.
If I bring this to court, I could definitely get compensation.
What? What have I done, you say? Chris shouted. With a dispassion that surpassed mere exasperation, I explained to him.
You also sent your manuscripts to publishers under my name without my permission.
Ugh! Chris groaned. There's a record of the transmissions and testimony from the publishers. There's no way out for him. Furthermore, there are many issues with Chris's behavior. With these records and a doctor's medical report, I could perfectly divorce him anytime. Even if Chris throws a tantrum. In that case, I'm prepared to go to court.
You're joking, right? Come on, Julie, this isn't.
I'm serious. My response was delivered with a cold determination. So, I was this angry with Chris. Discovering emotions I hadn't realized I had, I clenched my fists.
That's how it is. Goodbye, Chris. Don't contact me anymore.
Wait! Rethink this, Julie!
Where's the need to rethink?
I continued coldly.
There's not a single benefit for me in staying married to you. It's just stress. You'll regret this. When I become an author, you'll see.
He was still saying such naive things. Sure, there are authors who debut in their 30s. I know some people who have done that. But they put in the effort. Unlike Chris, who uses work as an excuse, not studying and trying to climb using me.
I'll write an exposé about how unsuitable a housewife you were. It's better if you don't. I'll hold a press conference and refute all your claims. I'm not hiding or running. I'll face it head on and win. Since my position, contrary to what Chris has just denied, is actually welcomed by the public. I didn't want to upset you by saying this, but I won a major literary award I've been aiming for years. What? When I mentioned the name of the award, Chris went silent as if frozen. Even someone like him understands the significance of that award. I have an interview lined up, and I'll announce there all the ill treatment I received from my nasty ex-husband and his son. Wait! What do you think will happen to me if you do that? Fear seeped into Chris's voice. Understandably so. The interview would be broadly covered and possibly broadcasted. If I hint at discord with my husband, the media will swarm all over it. Chris is finished. I could keep quiet about it. In return, don't call me anymore. Julie! Do you really hate me that much? His voice was soaked in self-pity. The irritation I had almost forgotten returned. Let me ask you this. Did you ever, even for a moment, actually like me? What are you saying? You never really saw me, not as a writer, but as a person. I always knew. Chris's interest was only in my social standing. That was fine. If it made my parents feel at ease. I didn't hate Chris from the start. Day by day, meticulously, the affection just wore thin. Until now. Goodbye. I ended the call unilaterally. Afterward, Chris called several times, but I didn't respond. The following days passed relatively peacefully. Trouble arose 5 days later in the afternoon. Enough already! That day, from morning, my phone had been ringing non-stop. Finally irritated, I answered and heard Michael's voice. This damn old lady! What's wrong, Michael? Although he always spoke that way, my response was tinged with a sigh as Michael furiously continued. Because of what you said about Dad, he got fired from his job. What? I hadn't actually said anything about Chris. Even at the interview, I had refrained from discussing my personal life. But thinking about it, perhaps my father might have a clue. Although he is retired now, the connections he made in his youth are still active. I had confided in my parents about the treatment I received at their house. While my father had listened silently, he might have been furious internally. And then, my father probably ended up talking about Chris, his son-in-law, to his acquaintances. That's unfortunate. Don't talk about it like it's someone else's problem. Even so, Chris and I are already divorced. It really is someone else's problem now. Since my father's acquaintances are all corporate executives, maybe the word got to the company Chris was working for. Oh no! Even a child could understand the gravity of the situation. The story spread by my father beautifully shattered Chris's social credibility. Moreover, it's likely that no company will hire him in the future. Your husband is so reliable, isn't it? I remember how our irresponsible neighbor used to laugh and say how reliable an older husband is. Human prejudice can be terrifyingly powerful. I know that. My hospital bills are unpaid, and I got kicked out in the middle of physical therapy. What's going to happen to my legs now? That's strange. You got rid of the parasite as you wished, so you should be heading towards a happy ending, right? I don't know. Michael cried out and then began to cry. For a young child like Michael, it must seem hopeless. Since his leg physical therapy isn't complete, there's no guarantee his legs will function properly ever again. It's like a bad ending. It's all your fault! Michael continued screaming as he cried. Is it immature to treat a child like this? No. Michael is a human being. And he must take responsibility for his own words. You've stolen our future. From a parasite to that, huh? I sighed and shook my head. Michael hasn't learned anything. I've been hurt by Chris's actions and Michael's words. Even now. Pay me alimony. You want to go to court? Then I'll face it. Chris would cry and resist, but it can't be helped. Michael has already said so. I'll win against you in court. Okay.
Shortly after this conversation, I filed a lawsuit against Chris. An ending instigated by an oblivious Michael.
Michael, what have you done?
Chris was sobbing in the courtroom. The result was a resounding victory for me. Chris, already financially strained, now had to pay alimony to me as well.
This wasn't supposed to happen.
Michael, now visibly shaken and frightened, caught my eye. I shrugged and left. Chris apparently had to sell his beloved car. Still unable to raise enough for the alimony, he went around begging relatives and acquaintances for money. And the alimony he finally gathered meant nothing to me.
If only you had apologized, that would have been enough.
Neither of them ever reflected on their actions. They just cried and shifted the blame. Whatever happens to them is none of my concern now.
I can't find a new job, and Michael's legs are still messed up.
What are we supposed to do now?
Figure it out yourself.
They are adults and should be responsible for their own words. Michael's legs remained unhealed due to being expelled from the hospital, and he continues to live a life bound to a wheelchair.
I can't play soccer or baseball anymore. I'm left out because I can't play with everyone.
The last time Michael contacted me, he said this through tears. If they hadn't driven me away then, his legs might have healed by now.
You should have thought more carefully before you spoke.
It's a costly lesson. Michael lost his chance at salvation through his own words. Unemployed, Chris took Michael and moved back to his parental home. Since then, I've heard nothing more about them. I'm not considering remarriage anymore. I just happened to get a weird partner before, but even so, I don't feel like trying my luck at marriage again. Instead, I found a new hobby. Travel.
Are you going out again?
Yes. It's for research. I replied, though it was half for fun. Fun, as in, just going around and being curious about different places. Writers are often thought to be indoor types, but actually, it takes a lot of physical effort, and when stuck in writing, many want to just go somewhere. Not to tourist spots, but quiet, secluded places. Divorced and unburdened, I feel I can go anywhere.
Well then.
I boarded the train alone, looking out the window. As the train started moving, my spirits lifted. Where shall I go today?